Hello everybody, this is Jim Rose with NorCal Slot Car Scene. We've just finished up a very successful season of racing 1/32 scale cars at Motown Raceway. This past year we raced NSR F1 and slotted Group C. Since both of those classes are for essentially vintage cars, we've decided to add a third class for 2023 with contemporary race cars, that being the GT3 class. For racing at Motown Raceway in Modesto, California, we've decided to race the GT3 cars that are produced by NSR, Racer Sideways, and Scale Auto. That'll give us a huge variety of cars to choose from. To keep everything equal between the different brands of cars, we've decided on a spec drivetrain. You'll be required to run the NSR 21.4 motor that comes stock in the NSR cars, along with a stock 1331 gearing. If you're running a Racer Sideways or Scale Auto car, you will be required to put this motor in the car with an equivalent gear ratio. Besides the common drivetrain, all bodies must remain stock and unmodified. The two current classes, slotted Group C and NSR F1, are pretty limited in the modifications you're allowed to do. This new GT class, we're going to open it up a little bit and allow quite a few more modifications. You'll be allowed to change the stiffness of the chassis and the pod, the rear tires and wheels are open, and you'll also be allowed to stiffen the front and the rear with axle spacers and axle tubes. The axle tube is simply two bushings joined by an aluminum spacer. It's a one-piece unit produced by Slotting Plus. What this does is stiffen the rear end and helps control the chattering that's common in these cars because of the extreme torque of the motor. What you see here is my homemade axle tube using the stock bushings and a piece of aluminum tubing cut to size. I've joined these with silicone adhesive and then snapped into the chassis. The Slotting Plus Combi axle tube took care of stiffening up the rear end. Then we looked at the front end, and there's quite a bit of slop in the NSR front axle as it comes from the factory. So what we've done is cut two 5.2 millimeter aluminum tube bushings and inserted them into the chassis. These bushings are now controlled by the set screws that control the ride height. And now the front end is extremely free and has zero slop in it. If you plan on building one of these cars, a complete set of rules can be found on norcalslotcar.com. We had a test and tune session for these cars at Motown Raceway last weekend. About 6 racers showed up with their new GT3 cars. I started with an NSR McLaren. The modifications that I did to the car were changing the chassis out from the stock black chassis to a stiffer white chassis, changing the guide from the stock guide to a Slotting Plus super long guide, using the rear tires and wheels off the Formula One car, and adding a Slotting Plus Combi axle tube. The NSR angle winder motor has a lot of torque. To get the car smooth, the first thing you have to do is screw the motor into the pod. From there, the white stiffer chassis helps. All of this combined ties together and stiffens up the chassis and lets the tires work better. For rear tires and wheels, I'm using the standard stock wheels that come on the NSR F1 car. I prepared 2 sets of tires for the test day. Both were trued down to about 18 millimeters in diameter. One set was full width at 13 millimeters, and the other I narrowed to 11.5 millimeters. The 13 millimeter wide tires worked well, but when I tried the narrowed tires, they rolled through the corners better and still had enough traction coming off the corners, so I think that's what I'm going to start with. As for the front ride height, all chassis and guides are different, but the car I have required about 20 thousandths in spacers to get the proper ride height. Once I got the front ride height for the chassis where I wanted it, I adjusted the front wheels and tires so they're just barely touching the track when the car runs. I set the pod so it moves freely, but without any excessive vertical movement. After running the car on the track, it was still not quite right, so I started adding some ballast. And I ended up with about 2.5 to 3 grams on each side of the chassis and about 2 grams in the nose of the car right next to the guide. That seemed to work the best and made the car run very smooth. At the end of the day of testing, The car was running pretty well. It was running very smooth off the corners and was turning some pretty decent lap times, but right now we really have nothing to compare it with other than the F1 cars, which use the same motor. The track record for F1 is 5.76. This car ran a fast lap of 5.70. So we'll see what the competition has, but that's what I've got for now. At the next test, I'm going to try the same setups on my NSR Mercedes AMG GT3. In addition, there's a couple other things I'm going to try. One, I want to try the green harder chassis and see how that works, as well running the full narrow tires like we do on the F1 cars. That's it for now. I hope to see you out at the races and hopefully some testing sessions. And I think this is going to be a great class for Modesto, and hopefully we'll be able to run it at other tracks in Northern California as well. Thanks for watching. This is Jim Rose with NorCal Slot Car Scene.